Well, let's dive in to the subject matter of the why and the how of environmental assessment of forest management on public land. So, the way I would like us to think through this today is to start by looking at how forest management and silviculture have evolved in Canada, at least over the period that I've been watching it. I started my career in forestry as a forest firefighter in the mid-70s in Northern Ontario, and have taken a deep interest in what's going on in the woods since that time. I've also been watching environmental assessment, mostly as a researcher, since 1981. And so I want to talk a little bit about the evolution of environmental assessment processes in Canada as well. Then I'll have a quick look at what applications of environmental assessment have been made to forest management on public lands in various provinces in Canada. And when that's done, we'll have a little conversation about why we should apply the concepts of or the process of environmental assessment to forest management. And I will then say a few things about where we are in Nova Scotia with respect to this topic. And then I'll make a quick conclusion, and then we can head into the question period. So I've developed a concept of the evolution of forest management and silviculture in which I see three kind of eras of our approach. The first one I would call unplanned messy, which prevailed in many parts of Canada up until the let's say 50 years ago, which I would call unplanned messy forest management, where we'd repeatedly, after, on perhaps a schedule of 4 to 6 times a century, we go into stands and cut the best and leave the rest. And that's the legacy we inherited when we started to get sophisticated about forest management in the 1970s. But we then adopted what I would call the planned clean model, which is kind of an agricultural model where clear cutting was seen to be the way to do things. And then regeneration was largely by planting. And then there were treatments of weeding and thinning and so on afterwards. Very much an even-aged silvicultural model. Then in the 1990s, it was my observation that during a whole bunch of developments in Canada around improvements to forest management, we adopted what I call it the planned messy model. And in important. Whoops, there's another photo. So carrying on a little bit with the story of the evolution of forest management and silviculture, we pretty much have roads to everywhere in the wooded landscape, and it seems we need more all the time because we go to places where we don't have, we want to get to places to do forest management operations where we don't have high quality roads for the equipment, and we keep building roads. I'm reminded that we even had a program nationally called Roads to Resources from back in the Diefenbaker government era in the late 1950s. Where it was seen to be essential for the development of the nation to get more and more roads built, particularly in Canada's north. The demand for timber sometimes seems insatiable. Of course, it depends very much on mills and markets, but if you look at the rates at which we've been harvesting timber across Canada from the 1970s till now, it seems that we're on balance in many markets doing reasonably well in servicing the global demand for forest products. We still have across Canada abundant timber harvests taken by clear cutting, And it's only recently that we've, in most provinces, brought the protected areas networks up to what many people consider to be baseline levels. For a long time, it seemed like 12% was the right target. And we met and exceeded that in Nova Scotia some years ago. So that's also underway in the forest lands of the country. So in sum, looking at Nova Scotia, I would say that commercial timber production is more or less ubiquitous across the province, and in my view, it so far has had considerable environmental impacts that we really haven't accounted for very well in our processes of assessment. Now let's take a look at the evolution of environmental assessment in Canada. The Canadian the whole concept of environmental assessment was actually born 50 years ago to the year, in 1970, when the Americans brought in the National Environmental Policy Act with an action-forcing mechanism that said all federal decisions had to have an environmental assessment and an environmental impact statement associated with them. So Canada was watching this and followed suit, put a process in place to develop the federal environmental assessment enterprise. That was put in place in January 1974. And many people who follow this will know then that we've had many iterations of what federal environmental assessment looks like, including the new Federal Impact Assessment Act. So environment has actually been taken out of the name of the act, quite curiously. And this happened, in the past year or so. Now, federal environmental assessment only applies to things in federal jurisdiction. And so it doesn't apply to Crown land forest management because the Crown land forests across Canada are essentially under the jurisdiction of the provincial governments. Now, sometimes the federal process is invoked in relation to forest management. We've seen a couple of examples in the West, particularly in Alberta, where major river crossings needed to be made for access roads. And I think it was the Navigable Waters Protection Act that was invoked as federal jurisdiction to have federal environmental assessment of the water crossings, the bridges. But by and large, the federal process doesn't apply. The provinces, just like the states in the U.S. and the various states in Australia and in federal systems, our provinces all put environmental assessment processes in place. I think they were all in place by the early 1980s, so that matters of provincial jurisdiction would run through the provincial processes. Matters of federal jurisdiction would run through the federal process. But by the way, most of our provinces, if not all, have articulation agreements with the federal government so that if a project comes along and it looks like there's both provincial and federal environmental jurisdiction, then the two government levels can collaborate so that there's just one assessment. Most environmental assessment processes across Canada have two levels. The federal one at the beginning had 3 levels, but most have gone for 2 levels. And I've just given them comical names. The EA Light is for small projects. And in these small projects, there's rather not very sophisticated work on impact prediction. There are usually no formal hearings. There's probably little monitoring to do. It would be highway improvements, short stretches of highway in Nova Scotia. It would be large gravel pits, maybe some small wind farms would go through the EA Light process. We'd call that Class 1 in Nova Scotia. And then there are the big and controversial projects, and I call that EA Heavy. And then all of the indicators of the level of sophistication go up. There's sophisticated science, there are usually hearings involved, and often there are many conditions on approval if a project is indeed recommended or decided upon by the ministers to go ahead. And in Nova Scotia, we would call that Class 2. I think if we had a new pulp mill in Nova Scotia, that would be in Class 2. We had the Whites Point Quarry, that was Class 2, but it had federal provincial collaboration. So the Class 2 environmental assessment in Nova Scotia applies to big projects or controversial projects, even if they're not that large. So let's have a look across Canada and see how the other provinces have been thinking about the application of environmental assessment to Crown land forest management. So 4 provinces actually have made the forest management enterprise on Crown land to be subject to the regulations of the EA process: Saskatchewan, Manitoba, Ontario, and Newfoundland. And there are 2 basic approaches that have been used. One is to see forest management on an industrial forest management unit as an individual undertaking, which requires its own individual environmental assessment. Saskatchewan and Manitoba adopted that approach. 2 provinces, though, put forest management through what's called the class environmental assessment approach. And Ontario started earlier and had a most exaggerated environmental assessment, which I'll speak a little bit about. And Newfoundland followed suit, but later on with a much more slimmed down model of the class approach. So the class approach means that if there is a set of undertakings that are essentially the same in a kind of a generic way, but maybe have local nuances that are the differences, perhaps it's more appropriate, rather than pushing them all through the process for individual undertakings, if the proponent can assure the Ministry of Environment that the planning process for those undertakings can really satisfies the principles of environmental assessment, then they wouldn't need to go through the individual EA. So the Ontario story is actually quite fascinating. The Ministry of Natural Resources in Ontario knew from the time the Ontario Environmental Assessment Act was put in place in 1975 that it would be subject that timber management on Crown land would be subject to the Act. And it was only in 1988 that finally an environmental assessment document had been submitted and hearings began. The hearings started shortly before I arrived in Thunder Bay as a newly minted professor. And so I got to observe the ongoing machinations of that environmental assessment hearing. It's probably the largest environmental assessment hearing ever in the world, and it's probably the most expensive environmental assessment ever undertaken. There were 400 hearing days over a period of 4 years, and thousands of documents submitted by the proponent, which was the Ministry of Natural Resources, and various interveners. And it took up to 6 years. It was only in 1994 that the findings of the Class EA panel were transmitted to government. The interesting thing about the outcome of the Class EA approach in Ontario is that after 45 years, from 1975 to 2020, the timber management on Crown land in Ontario is now, or will be very, very soon, not subject to the environmental assessment regulations in that province. So the way I look at it is that it took that long, 45 years, before the government of Ontario, or shall we say the people of Ontario, could feel some assurance that the forest management process operating on Crown land all the way from Ottawa to Kenora was responsible from the perspective of environmental impacts. Well, just before we leave that slide, I make a point. What's my picture there? I think it's 10 binders. Yeah, it's 10 binders which represent the forest management plan and environmental assessment that Wirehouse for its large license area in the southern boreal forest of Saskatchewan. So that's, I don't think anybody is hoping that kind of documentation becomes the norm in the application of environmental assessment to forest management. But because I was consulted on this environmental assessment of forest management, I managed to get a copy. And I'd like to show this picture just to scare people with respect to what the documentation for some environmental assessments might actually look like. So you might ask the question, it's a very fair question, I think, why we would want to apply environmental assessment forest management. Through the 1990s in particular, and even beyond, there have been many kind of processes and mechanisms to bring the quality of forest management up with respect to environment and social matters. But still, there could be an argument that environmental assessment has a role to play. And the first thing is that forest management has substantial effects on ecological, social, and economic values. So on one hand, we might say, yeah, environmental assessment was invented for projects that we build. It was meant for pipelines and resource extraction like mines and highways and other infrastructure. Well, we do have some of that in forest management because we do need to build some new roads. But I would argue that the things we do to the trees in forest management are at least as much a driving force of ecological, social impacts as putting infrastructure in the landscape. And so by making the changes we do to the vegetation structure, notably the trees, we do have in forest management quite substantial effects across the landscape. The Crown land does belong to the people of Nova Scotia, and so it's a public asset. And if the people of Nova Scotia feel that it's important to apply environmental assessment, then it seems reasonable to proceed with that and see how it works. Many observers, including me, have noted that forest management on Crown land in Nova Scotia today is not enjoying a very high level of public trust. And then finally, let me spend a moment speaking about spatial scale. So in my opinion, stand and site level impacts can be addressed using regulatory approach and BMPs. So we have standards for how to build roads. We have standards for how to do water crossings. We have standards for leaving snags and coarse woody debris, downed logs and so on in service blocks. But we need more sophisticated approaches to get at landscape level impacts. So what about the design of the entire road network? What about water quality in large watersheds? And what about habitat for wide-ranging species? These kinds of concerns are not well handled through a kind of a regulatory approach or a best management practice. And so looking after the sustainability of those valued ecosystem components really demands an analysis of cumulative effects across broad spaces through long periods of time. Let's come home to Nova Scotia and talk about where we are today here. So the independent review of forest practices was started in 2017. Professor Bill Leahy was charged with leading that independent review and filed his report with the government of Nova Scotia in August of 2018. The Leahy report is in 2 volumes, one of which Bill himself wrote, and the second of which is called an addendum, and it has a set of chapters that were written by various experts who have been retained as advisors to Bill as the review unfolded. I wrote the chapter 18 page and a half in that addendum, and it's entitled Environmental Assessment of Forest Management. And in that, I suggested to Bill that it would be a reasonable thing to recommend putting Crown land forest management into an EA process. Bill seemed to agree with that, and so his recommendation, number 20, reads as I've got it on the screen. So the forest management planning process for Crown lands should be conducted under a legislated environmental assessment process, either as a Class 2 environmental assessment under the Environment Act, or in a process that emulates the Class 2 process under the supervision of an independent third party or a panel under the authority of the Minister of now Lands and Forestry, or jointly the Ministers of Lands and Forestry and of Environment. And Leahy goes further. This process should be required before the issuing or renewal of forest utilization agreements. And one of the objectives of this assessment, and this is the part where I really like how Bill ties things together, will be to ensure that forestry on Crown land will adhere to the principles of and contribute to the objectives of ecological forestry. And that, of course, is reference to a whole bunch of the rest of the recommendations in his report, where implementation of ecological forestry and a triad model of forest management is the approach we ought to take in this province. So, as a consequence of Bill's the Leahy report, the Department of Lands and Forestry has established a set of teams working on implementation of specific recommendations. And if you go to the website I've highlighted in blue on the screen, you'll see the pages associated with ecological forestry, and you can find a description of an EA project team. All the other teams that are active also have their charters and descriptions in place on that website. The project objective for the EA team is to develop a proposed regulatory framework for government's consideration to review Crown land forest stewardship plans by applicable Crown forest agreement holders, either as Class 2 environmental assessment under the Environment Act, or in a process that is similar to the Class 2 process. So that objective begets the two initiatives that are underway at the moment. Part of the work of the team is to develop options for that regulatory framework. The second part, and this is alluded to in the objective, Crown land forest stewardship plans. The second initiative is to develop a guide for preparing those forest stewardship plans for Crown lands. And that is being, the heavy lifting there is being undertaken under contract by a consulting firm based in Thunder Bay called North Winds Environmental Services. And two of us, whom you may know here in Nova Scotia, are involved in the delivery of a draft guide to the province. Laird Van Dam, who is also an external expert helping out with the outcome-based forestry initiative, and me as part of that team. And I'm also helping the Old Forest team with the development of a revised policy on old forests. So I guess the question is, how might this work? It's not really decided yet, and there's still a lot of consideration to be given as to whether the environmental assessment choice, the choice of process, is Class 2, or whether it's a custom designed process that might take into account the notion that forest stewardship plans for Crown land are a bit of a different animal compared to most of the kinds of projects that would go through an EA process. Not so much infrastructure and a lot of manipulation of the vegetation patterns on the landscape. So it may turn out that there's nuances to the way the process should be implemented so that it's appropriate for that kind of undertaking. But it seems fairly clear at a kind of a high order level that we would expect to see a greater number and diversity of opportunities for both the public and Indigenous peoples of Nova Scotia to become engaged. in the overall forest management planning and environmental assessment process. And without a doubt, a greater use of sophisticated forecasting tools to predict landscape level environmental impacts. And the Department of Lands and Forestry, and formerly under as the Department of Lands of Natural Resources, has been working for at least a decade or two on developing some of those sophisticated tools. And that's an outcome of the landscape planning pilot project that has been underway for some years and is bringing forward its first fruit in tools and guidance on how those tools are to be used. So I thought I would just take a page out of my teaching book and stand back a bit from Nova Scotia and forests to think through what we can expect from an environmental assessment process, whether it's applied to forest management or any other kind of undertaking. And in my teaching, which I've done probably for 30 years at the graduate level at a couple of universities, I've developed a model of understanding environmental assessment that looks like this. I have 3 dimensions in my model. One dimension is the procedural dimension. It's really all about the regulatory regime that is in place to see that environmental assessment gets done. The second dimension I call the political dimension, not because it has anything to do with political parties, but because it has very much to do with people's levels of influence on what happens, and it's the part that's really played out in the public and stakeholder engagement side of environmental assessment. The third, which is my favorite from deep in my academic history, is the analytical dimension. And I'm very interested in how we undertake the work of science so that it has the most appropriate fit into both procedural and political decision making. So we can justify all 3 of these dimensions quite easily. There is a process, and you have to pay attention to it. Otherwise, timely approvals may not emerge. Now, getting timely approvals also may not emerge because some of these other dimensions, these other 2 dimensions, go awry too. But it's important to pay attention to the procedural dimension, especially if you're either in government or a proponent. The political dimension is easily justified in 2 respects. One is for proponents to be able to try to get buy-in to the projects they want to implement. So the whole concept of social license comes into play here. And also to get insight, because oftentimes in engagement processes, very knowledgeable people become involved and can bring understanding about the way ecosystems work that might not otherwise have been made available to the proponent in coming up with the undertaking that they want to do. So we also get a fair amount of insight from the political dimension. And then, of course, the analytical dimension is really dedicated entirely to getting insight. It's all about understanding what the potential consequences of going forward with something out in the ecosystems of wherever before we do that, so that we make sure that the impacts are understood and that they are adjusted in one way or another with respect to what the project looks like, so that those impacts are acceptable. And so the situation when environmental assessment really works is when the procedural dimension, the political dimension, and the analytical dimension all are really humming together. And it really requires a balance across those 3 with strong performance in each dimension. And with my students, I talk about what happens when you only have one of these dimensions that's working and the other 2 are not, or when 2 dimensions are working and one is not. These are unfavorable circumstances in the application of EA. And what I'm really hoping for is wherever we end up with a process to apply EA to forest management in Nova Scotia, that we've got all three of these dimensions of EA working closely together. So to conclude, I would suggest that forest management in Nova Scotia Crown land is entering a new era. The focus is clearly on the conservation of biodiversity and other socio-ecological values. That's very clear in the Leahy Review and in government's response to it. And also that silvicultural practices are dedicated to developing older and more diverse forests. Leahy spoke to this very directly in his review, and I think the evolution of the new silviculture guide for the ecological matrix is dedicated to making exactly this happen. Through the EA process, I see great opportunity for attention to landscape level cumulative environmental effects. Cumulative environmental effects is a rather thorny domain. It's got a lot of confusion in it. But if there were any environmental effects that are the really important ones, in my opinion, it's the cumulative ones. We've got an opportunity now for increased quality and quantity of public scrutiny on the strategic management directions for large forest management units. And we have arguably 3 of those, or maybe 4 of those in the province, and a couple of smaller ones like the Medway Community Forest. And then finally, it's high time, I think, as many folks who've listened to my previous talks on various occasions would know, it's finally time to face the reality of the changing climate. And since forest management is a long-term venture, or if it isn't, it sure as heck should be, and we're often making forecasts about sustainable wood supplies and environmental values out many decades into the future, we need a process where the uncertainty about those potential effects can be taken into account. And so my final statement would be that environmental assessment is a potentially vital tool, a very valuable tool to address these elements of the new era in forest management. So that concludes the presentation. And on my title slide, I've just added my email address in case it's desired by anybody. If you'd like to respond to me directly after the talk. I certainly won't be looking at it over the next, 20 minutes while Heba is asking or is relating to me any questions you might have typed into the chat box. So there we are. Thanks for listening, and I look forward to our conversation. Heba, are you there?
Hello?
Yeah.
All right. So let's get started with the questions. So the first one is asking whether the environmental assessment would apply to production forestry.
So that's unknown to me. However, it would seem reasonable that it would be. I don't know where the province is going with its thinking on the spatial allocation of high production forestry, but presumably in at least the larger commercially oriented forest utilization license agreement areas, the big licenses, there would be territory allocated to high production forestry along with the rest of the territory allocated to so-called ecological forestry or the ecological matrix. And so presumably the forest stewardship plan for the entire license area would include both the high production and the ecological forestry areas, and therefore it would seem reasonable to me to assume that the environmental assessment process would apply to the whole package. including both those.
Okay, cool. Just 1 second, actually. It's a bit of an. All right, so there's kind of a follow-up to this question. How do you see the timeline for the environmental assessments unfolding, and how does that relate to times for high production forestry, ecological forestry matrix, and old forest projects?
Yeah, so I can't be sure there, except to say that Leahy's recommendation said that before any license is created or renewed, that the environmental assessment process should be applied. So I'm not privy to the government's intended schedule of implementation of a new EA process, other than to say that it can't be started until the regulatory framework is in place and the guide to preparing forest stewardship plans is in place and approved. Then it could proceed. Whether that's ahead of or behind some of the other initiatives like the settling of the high production forestry thing, the outcome-based forestry thing, the old forest policy, the silviculture guide to the ecological matrix. I'm not sure how those all are expected to dovetail into some kind of a grand plan over the next couple of years.
Okay. Thank you. So, another question. Will impact assessment address carbon sequestration requirements?
So, will the impact assessment process address carbon sequestration? It's hard to imagine that competent environmental assessment of forest management could not do so in 2020 and beyond. And the expectation for that stems partly from the creation of the so-called criteria and indicators of sustainable forest management by the Canadian Council of Forest Ministers back in 1995. So for 25 years, we have been in a mentality of profiling the carbon budget of managed forests rather more and more seriously all the time. And so if we develop a set of requirements for what should be in a forest stewardship plan, it's inconceivable that we wouldn't have a requirement to undertake a carbon budget modeling exercise that would reveal the overall pattern of carbon sequestration and storage over the life of the plan. And fortunately, the province is already ahead in this respect by having an expert on staff in the Lands and Forestry Department whose specialty is to develop tools and show people how these kinds of calculations need to be done.
All right, yeah. So next question. In regards to the forest stewardship plan, which of the lands and forestry projects does that come under?
Oh, so the actual the guide to developing forest stewardship plans is part of the work of the EA team, which is part of the work, the overall bundle of work responding to Leahy's recommendations. When a forest stewardship plan is developed, that will be a matter for, so I guess that the forest stewardship plans would be developed by the license holders, which is the standard case across the entire country. more or less, and with oversight and guidance by the Department of Lands and Forestry.
Thank you. So another question. The new Impact Assessment Act is designed to better reflect values that are important to Canadians, including Indigenous knowledge. How do you feel this will be integrated into the impact assessment on forest management in Nova Scotia?
So I imagine that the application of an environmental assessment process to forest stewardship plans will have 2, maybe 3 avenues for Indigenous knowledge to become or to be play a role in the understanding of what's important to people and what kind of impacts might be expected. So there can be a role to play there in the direct engagement with Indigenous people during the preparation of a forest stewardship plan, and that would be engagement convened by the license holder as part of the overall process of engagement. And then secondly, it's my understanding that there are higher order processes of engagement between the government of Nova Scotia and the Mi'kmaq people of Nova Scotia. And no doubt there are opportunities for Indigenous knowledge to be critical in bringing resolution to any issues in decision making at that level as well.
Okay, great, thank you. I think we just have one last question. So circling back to the forest stewardship plan, how does that relate to the forest management guide?
So the current language, I think, has changed a bit. The forest management guide, I think, has a new name called the Silviculture Guide to the Ecological Matrix. And so that guide, under either name, is dedicated to making sure that stand by stand or harvest block by harvest block, the decisions made are consistent with natural disturbance patterns and some of the silvicultural prescriptions that have permeated our thinking in the last couple of years, particularly the irregular shelterwood concept. So the silviculture guide is dedicated to making sure that what happens on a site is consistent with our current thinking about ecological responsibility. The forest stewardship plan is going to have its major contribution in looking at environmental and social issues at a broader spatial level, like an eco-district or a watershed or the entire license area. And so there are considerations or there are issues and values that extend beyond the site. And there are important, what shall I say, the important approaches needed to understand long-term, broad-scale, and cumulative effects that actually go way beyond what you can accomplish simply by making sure that site by site you've done something right or something good for the site. It's the sum of all the sites, treated or not, intervened in or not, that are going to implicate the long-term cumulative effects of forest management. So that's where the payoff, in my view, is for becoming much more sophisticated in the forest stewardship plan.
Okay. So I think you kind of already answered this, but I'm gonna ask it anyways. Can you elaborate a bit on what is involved in a forest stewardship plan? Since there seems to be a lot of overlap with other projects. For example, the Old Forest Management Plan. Is it the main venue? Is it the main venue for biodiversity landscape planning?
Yes, it is. We've been having lots of conversations about this in the various teams and with the people I'm involved with, and it seems that the forest stewardship plan should become the major vehicle by which the public can be assured that that landscape scale concepts are attended to and looked after from a kind of a sustainability point of view. So we have initiatives like the Old Forest Policy Renewal, which is dedicated to old forests under formal and policy protection. We've got outcome-based forestry, looking at ways not to or ways to encourage professional creativity in meeting the objectives of forest management. A central piece of the forest stewardship plan is to put an onus on the land manager, who is the license holder, to deliver on a wide spectrum of the public's forest values in the implementation of a whole suite of activities, including the access network, the forest harvest, the regeneration, the protection, and all that kind of stuff. So really the forest stewardship plan, at the same time as the silviculture guide for the ecological matrix, the two of them in tandem will be the major implementation instruments to ensure that forest management is going in a direction that the people of Nova Scotia feel comfortable with.
Great. I think that's it for questions. Thank you so much for taking time out of your day, Peter, to come and talk to us about environmental assessment. I think we're going to end here since no one else has any questions. Thanks for everyone else for joining in. Sorry, just one second.
Thank you, Heba.
Sorry, guys. Yeah, so thank you everyone for joining in. Thank you, Peter, for talking about environmental assessment. Just for next week, our next webinar is going to be about identifying forest plants with Alan Bellevue from Acadia, from the herbarium. Other than that, just keep checking on the website if you'd like to listen in on more of our webinars in the Forestry Professional Series. We're going to have lots more until the end of the summer. And stay tuned later on. I'm going to be sending out an email with the recording and the presentation link, so you'll have that kind of resource if you want to check in later and read a little bit more about it. All right. Thank you so much.